If you can train yourself to perceive the world in a certain way, you can basically lock yourself into permanent flow. Every single belief we have affects how well we see reality. We tend to only really be consciously aware of the macro decisions we make, or the decisions that we deem really important. But those actually make up the smallest percentage of decisions that we make in a given day. The decisions that have the most influence collectively are all those small decisions.
For episode 49, my guest is Justin Faerman, who is working to create large-scale shifts in human consciousness and integrate intuitional skills more deeply into the business world and everyday life. He is also the co-founder of Conscious Lifestyle magazine and the Flow Consciousness Institute. What would it mean to feel effortlessly supported in your life? This is what we explore here in this conversation. If more of us were in flow, what would the impact of this be on a wider collective level? I am recording this introduction from India, where I'm currently hosting the Heart of Transformation pilgrimage and yoga retreat. We have just been to some incredible sacred sites and temples, and we walked around the mountain Arunachala on the night of the full moon. We are now gathered in a beautiful retreat center, which has been created to raise money to protect Ayurvedic herbs in the Himalayas. If you are interested in joining me for this kind of adventure, then you can come to Rishikesh in March, where I'll be facilitating Into the Heart of Yoga, which is a volunteering yoga retreat at Ramina's Garden Children's Home. Or you can join me in Spain in May for Wild Grace, a heroine's journey, if you identify as a woman, that is. And if you would like to join my presence mentoring program for some focus on clearing your patterning and integrating supportive practices into your life, the next cohort starts in February and applications are open now. You can find out more about this over at www.amisha.co.uk/leadership. It's a very unique program with really attentive one-to-one support at a very, very reasonable price. And so I hope that some of you can join us, because I know that it's been really powerful for those that have been on it. One of the women on the program recently shared, since she's been working with presence mentoring, she's felt her heart swell each week with gratitude and wonder at how blessed she is and how much space for beauty there is as she goes slower and takes in the view. She said, "It's exactly what I hoped for, and it feels like home." As always, we love hearing from you about how these interviews are moving you, so do get in touch. And if you haven't yet downloaded our gift, go to our website, www.thefutureisbeautiful.co, click on gift and download that ebook. I hope that you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community, or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. Justin, welcome to The Future is Beautiful. What an absolute pleasure to have you here on the show. You and I became friends on social media maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Having your presence a little bit on my online world. And then it's really beautiful that we're now here in Bali together and can sit down and get to know each other and share it with our beautiful community.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm glad our paths finally crossed in person.
Yes.
5-6 years, that's a long time.
Yeah, I think so. I feel like it was, maybe around 2013.
Wow.
I realized I just said beautiful several times because it's really hard not to be tapped into that kind of beauty of existence when you're here in Bali.
Totally. I mean, it's the namesake of your podcast. So yeah, we're definitely surrounded by immense beauty, always, but especially right now. Yeah.
Especially right now. We're at an amazing place called Trinity Gardens, and there are butterflies everywhere. and a really special place. I want to ask you about this thing called flow, because it's a big word these days and a big kind of aspiration as well, to find our flow, to live in flow. I feel like for many people, it's also a bit of an enigma.
Yeah.
What is that, and how do you do that? Can you share a little bit about what that means to you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the big question, what is flow?
Just start right there. Totally. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, you'd think we'd be experts at describing it. And we are on one level, but there's another aspect of it where I could, it's kind of like the Tao Te Ching, where it's like, sometimes you know it better by what it's not than what it is. So there's a paradoxical depth to it that makes it really hard to like give people a definition that encompasses everything. It's really when people experience flow, that's when you really know it. But if I was to try and use words to describe it, flow to me is really one of the peak experiences that we can have as a human being, to really be completely, depending on which side of the flow coin you talk about, because there's flow states and flow consciousness. Flow consciousness is what the work that we're really bringing to the world, and they're on the same continuum, but opposite poles. So flow state, is like kind of an embodied peak state of experience. Heightened creativity, intense present moment awareness, timelessness, experience of effortlessness, even doing complex things. Flow consciousness, on the other hand, is more a way of life, a way of being. We could almost call it a stage of development, where you're essentially learning to perceive yourself, the world, everything you experience in a way that allows you to have a continual experience of effortlessness, where you, instead of are at odds with life or struggling against life or thinking that something shouldn't be happening or should be happening or whatever, you're actually being effortlessly supported by life in your growth. And there's a couple key access points for it that I'm happy to dive into. We can talk about, but as a general like concept, like flow is really when everything that you want and need to be wildly successful, giving your gifts to the world and living your purpose, comes to you effortlessly and in perfect synchronicity. Like that's kind of a way to describe it that we think hones in a little bit on the experience. So being effortlessly supported, experiencing when you're in alignment with your purpose and you're doing this deep inner rewiring work to really feel supported in an effortless way, to be growing exponentially and having the right resources showing up at the right time. And we can unpack a lot of that, but yeah, flows, it's life.
Why is it so connected to a sense of purpose? Is it impossible to be in flow consciousness if we are spending our time and energy on things that are not our purpose?
Well, it depends. So the reason we use the word purpose is because like we believe that that's part of our arc as human beings. Like when we're really embracing our path in life, our hero's journey, like eventually purpose becomes a thing, whether or not we're conscious of it. So it doesn't have to be like a definitive thing. Like I know my purpose and I'm on target. Our purpose could be to be just wandering the earth for our entire lives, and it may not look like a classical purpose and how we might define it in college or in psychological terms. We think purpose is important because the way that, in our experience, the way that people typically find purpose is through alignment with intuition, and that's really one of the bedrocks of flow. So we don't actually teach people to find their purpose. We teach them to align with intuition, but that inevitably leads to purpose. And also, we think that there's an innate purpose in all things. The trees have their purpose. Like we, just by our aspect of being alive, we fit into a mosaic of purposes. So.
And sometimes that purpose is a growth moment. It's something that we didn't, necessarily want or feel like was a great thing that happened, but we meet up against something that gives us some keys and helps us to find something else. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, purpose. In flow, we teach that all experiences are happening for our highest good. So whatever we're experiencing, there's a deep lesson in there, a deep invitation to growth, whether it's challenging or really fun. And so purpose can emerge from either ends of the spectrum or somewhere right in the middle, so.
Beautiful. What does it mean to align with intuition from your perspective?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to phrase the question. So to align with intuition for us is really about like tuning into that as the main way that you navigate through life. So in our experience, if people use intuition at all, it's really when someone has a big challenging decision to make where they're really uncertain and you can't figure it out with your mind, then we notice that people will, okay, well, how do I feel about this? And then they'll use that to make the decision because it's kind of maxing out their rational capacity. But that's really only using it occasionally. In flow, the goal is to operate from intuition as the main way that you navigate your life. And in our experience, when you do that, that's when you really access the highest levels of flow. Because encoded within intuition is essentially the roadmap for you being in the right place at the right moment at all times for whatever's in your highest good. When you live out of alignment with your intuition, you can start to kind of get off that core trajectory. And you can start to end up in situations that involve more struggle and suffering than are necessary to achieve whatever it is that you're here to do.
Yeah, I totally have experienced that. I've experienced when my mind like doesn't let me make the decision that feels the most aligned. And then normally it leads to a lot of trauma and things feeling really difficult.
Yeah.
And then I've experienced just trusting that feeling and just showing up somewhere because it didn't make sense. And maybe it wasn't the cheapest thing to do or whatever it is. And then just showing up there and it just feeling so clear and important why I chose to go and have breakfast in that place that day rather than eat the food that I'd bought that was in my fridge or, these like little things. And that's a kind of silly example. I've had it with very big things as well.
Yeah, like the way we're talking about flow is kind of at a meta abstract level, but when I find that the real magic of it is when you start to kind of get into the granularity of how it works. And then you start to see like the profundity of, for example, a principle like following your intuition. So like you mentioned something really simple, like going somewhere for breakfast or something that we often take for granted. I call these micro decisions. We tend to only really be consciously aware of the macro decisions we make or the decisions that we deem really important, but those actually make up the smallest percentage of decisions that we make in a given day. And like all of our micro decisions, like we make probably on the order of like 10 magnitudes more micro decisions than we do macro decisions. So the decisions that have the most influence collectively are all those small decisions. So when you choose to go to breakfast at a different place that you were maybe that your mind was telling you to go to, you end up in a completely different place in space and time, surrounded by completely different people with a completely different set of possibilities that can emerge from that. Every moment is that complex in our life, like literally every single moment. Even how many people have missed a car accident by 1 second or a scooter accident? I mean, if you had laid in bed for one more second, it could have completely changed the course of your entire life. So it's all these kind of unconscious decisions we're making that have the greatest influence. And so if we can learn to rewire ourselves to operate from intuition, then we are leveraging the power of 10, 15,000 decisions per day to like shoot us down this trajectory.
And so for someone that is listening and feels like they have no idea how to make a decision from their intuition, can you share how someone might start with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the primary like shift that you're making to start operating from intuition is moving out of the mind and into the felt sensation of the body and the space around the body too, because that's also the body, depending on how you look at it. And also not everybody experiences intuition through their body. Sometimes people experience it in the space around their bodies. Intuition is really moving into the felt sense and letting that dictate the decisions we make versus our rational logical mind. And there's an important distinction there too, that it's not that you're not going to think. It's not that you're not going to plan or you don't use your rational logical mind. It's just that you're essentially checking everything. So like if you have an idea to do something that comes from your mind and it seems like a really good idea, and then you tune into how you feel about it and you tune into your felt sense around it, and it also feels good there, then you're having a triangulation of your mind and your intuition, and that's really powerful. But what typically happens is that people will feel really bad about something, but they go, oh, but if I don't do this, then I think this bad thing is going to happen, or they start to project out into the future, and it's a psychological game where we play with ourselves. So then we start to get disconnected from our intuition, and people typically let their minds win. And like you said it really beautifully before, like sometimes it doesn't make sense. Like your intuition will tell you to do something that just feels completely different than what makes rational, logical sense. But at the same time, you can't see with your rational, logical mind where it's leading you. And so you're discounting all of that information that's coming through your felt sense. So a really easy practice is to just start to tune in and pay attention to how you feel and not your emotional state. That's a really important distinction as well too, because your emotions are an interpretation of your feelings. So your emotions is what you get when you process a feeling through your mind. But a felt sense, like something being heavy or light or expansive or dark or contracting, like those are what you're looking for to kind of give you that intuitional calibration towards whether something's a yes or a no.
And so for you, if something has like heaviness, do you just stay away from it now?
Most of the time. There's a couple like special cases where like, you know, you can get conflicting, like for example, we teach that if you're feeling really inspired about something, but it also scares you, that's actually a really strong yes, because your felt sense is saying yes. And then other parts of you are saying no. Parts of you that are saying no are like the limiting beliefs and the emotional patterns and the trauma, which saying yes to that thing will break you out of that. So there's a couple of like extenuating circumstances, but I mean, for me, 95% of the time I follow it. Sometimes I mess up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I guess another one is the getting used to being more tuned into yourself and the way that our patterns kind of mess with us and want to lead us in different directions. So for example, somebody says, okay, like I want to meet you to discuss this thing tomorrow morning. And you just feel like, I don't want to do that. Like I've got nothing to say actually. But then your body starts to go, you should go. And then sometimes realizing that that's just because you always used to go. And so that feels kind of natural. Mm-hmm. But then being able to tune in and being like, actually that it's that kind of feeling and that feeling that's natural is based on a really old pattern.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So we haven't talked about this so much yet as an aspect of flow, but like the foundational work of what we call inner flow is really a deep reprogramming and rewiring of your mind and your body and your limiting beliefs, your positive beliefs, and so on across this kind of inner spectrum to see the world in a way that engenders flow and to really like get out of old patterns because they can mess you up. If you have all kinds of emotional associations with, you know, being in groups of people, like it makes you feel anxious, it makes you feel, you know, if you have social anxiety, right? Like it's going to be really hard to discern what's your intuition and what's just anxiety when you're being invited into a group of people. Mm-hmm. So people are really served by doing this deep inner work. There's other reasons why that also increases flow besides just clarifying intuition, but that's a really important part of it. You know, when you are feeling centered and tranquil and neutral, you know, predominantly, or, you know, slightly happy predominantly, like that's a really good state to be able to tap into your intuition and like understand what it is and what it isn't.
Yeah. So was there a moment for you where you had a realization that you weren't living in flow and so started to explore this, or were you naturally in flow and then wanted to share it with others? How did it evolve for you?
Looking back at my life, like I kind of defaulted to living by some of the principles that we now teach without realizing it. My parents loved me to a fault. They were also very busy growing up. And so they weren't around a lot and I was left to my own quite a bit. And so I had the freedom to kind of decide what I was going to do with my time without having like strong programming about, oh, you should do this. You should do, you know, a lot of families, children will get, you know, you're going to be a doctor, or you need to do this, or you need to honor this family lineage or whatever. I didn't have any of that. So I got to kind of just pick what I was like felt most interesting to me. So I was always, that's just what I defaulted to. I was like, well, I have no rules about, you know, what to choose. So I'm just going to pick the thing that seems most interesting. I mean, why else would you choose anything else? That essentially is learning to tune into your intuition and like feel into what's most inspiring. So I just kind of did that my whole life for the most part. Because of the trajectory that took me on, I eventually like got to a place where I started to have awareness of what was happening. Like I had a mentor come into my life who was living in really high amounts of flow and I'd never met anybody that was before. And so that was the first time that like it kind of I became aware of it as like something that could be developed into like a competency. And it also fascinated me to no end. I was like, I have to learn how to do that. That is kind of the inflection point where I really got serious about like learning to live in flow and, kind of understanding how it worked. And then since then, it's just been moving more and more in that direction because I've been putting all my time and energy there.
Beautiful. So there was no like icky moment of feeling like this is the pain of life out of flow?
I mean, I definitely had my challenges for sure. Like even in following my inspiration and so on throughout my life, because I hadn't dealt with a lot of limiting beliefs and core wounds that we all pick up as children, that definitely took me pretty hard off path. So even though in some ways, like I was following what I wanted to be doing, in other ways I was self-sabotaging at the same time. And so there was a period from like ages maybe like 18 to 21 where I was super depressed. I wasn't eating well, I wasn't taking care of my body, I was doing drugs. And so that was the most challenging period of my life, hands down. And yet it was still an amazing experience of flow, even though in that moment it was challenging, like especially afterwards, like what we were saying, like that all experiences are kind of conspiring in our highest good. Like as challenging as that was, that also gave me so many things. Like I had a really deep understanding of the psychology of people that are depressed. I had a really deep understanding of the psychology of addiction. I had a deep experience of, learning what didn't work. And that experience ultimately shot me onto a really holistic, natural path. What pulled me out of that was like really getting focused on my consciousness and my spirituality and my healing and so on. If I hadn't have had that experience, I don't know if I would have felt such a strong pull to those things. Mm-hmm. And those things to me are everything. The peak of life, the experience that we can have it as human beings is as a result of like really pursuing those things to the highest degree. So my experience, I've definitely had both sides of the coin, mm-hmm. but everything was still in flow.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. How does flow consciousness support and enable us in showing up more in the world with all of the challenges that exist, be it the inequality, be it climate breakdown, violence, all of these kind of things that are very much part of the human world?
Totally. That's a great question. And I mean, there's multiple levels that I think it helps with that. The first is to really change the world. You're essentially trying to change a mass amount of individuals. So you changing yourself is an important part of solving these challenges like poverty and war and hunger and human trafficking and so on. Like all of those emerge from belief and emotional states that are essentially counter to what's in everyone's highest good, right? Mm-hmm. So war is an extension of separation consciousness. It's typically a result of people feeling hurt, not being able to forgive. Poverty a lot of times is a result of like belief structures held at a government level that are creating systemic inequality. So there's a lot of different layers that those things emerge from, but they're all consciousness layers. So if you really were able to kind of help people move into a space where they didn't hold the beliefs that then engendered that experience of reality, then you could essentially solve those problems at this kind of systemic, fundamental consciousness layer level. So because flow consciousness, as we teach it, is so focused on really helping us shift out of the exact beliefs, emotions, and traumas and so on that kind of give rise to those experiences, it's really powerful on that level as well. It helps us to kind of rapidly do the inner healing and rewiring work that allows us to move into an experience where we don't need struggle and suffering to learn. And we can start to learn more through joy and growth and, just falling in love with the process of change and transformation. So that's one layer. Another layer that it helps on is that typically when people work on issues like that, a lot of it tends to be from a place of what we would call activist consciousness, which is being against something. So being against hunger or being against, whatever thing. And coming from that place tends to engender imbalance in opposite directions. There's a really strong consciousness of being, I'm right, you're wrong, right? And that in and of itself is actually a limiting belief. So in flow, what ends up happening is people learn to act from a place of compassion and perfection instead of, righteousness and really strong right and wrong consciousness around activism. And you get completely different outputs when you do that. Like an example in a lot of ways is Gandhi, right? Gandhi came from a deep place of compassion. It would be so easy for them to have fought against the British and to use violence against violence. And yet they didn't. They sat in a place of compassion, and ultimately that was stronger than the force that the British had. So there's examples of people throughout history like sitting in that place, and flow basically invites you into that place. It leads you into that place of perfection and seeing the beauty even in the struggle and suffering, and then acting from there, which is a really powerful place to act from.
Who do you feel are like present day activists that are working in that way? I mean, perhaps Marianne Williamson.
Yeah, you actually took the word right out.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's definitely really acting from that. I mean, this is essentially what we're saying is like a non-dual place, you know, if you really break it down, like acting from a non-dual place. As in an activist level, Marianne Williamson, I don't know if I would say she's a perfect example of it, but definitely Oprah definitely comes grounded from a place that's like much more oriented towards healing and seeing like a spiritual truth or a deep lesson in what's happening. I'm trying to think who else. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that it's taking us both this long to try and think of more examples, because there are many, like in some ways, but they're also not necessarily big, prominent figures in our media. Like, you and I both know, we could list off maybe a bunch of mutual friends that we know, but we're trying to think, who will everyone listening have heard of? Totally. And those people aren't necessarily the ones that are getting the press because it's not that interesting for the media, who loves the story of the drama and the right and the wrong.
Totally. Yeah, no, you're 100% right. Yeah, it's like, I could name a lot of people, but the names would, I mean, I'm sure every listeners of this podcast would go Google them and like, you know, go down that rabbit hole.
We would put links to all of them in the show notes too.
Well, on that level, I'll just throw out a few. One of our advisors and a good friend of mine and someone that I'm collaborating with actively on some projects is David Gershon. He's probably one of the epitomes of this. I mean, I would say he's top 5 in the world, who's really doing large-scale positive social change work from a place of flow, 100%. When we met, actually, it was because we were at an event together in New York, and I gave a workshop, and he was in the workshop, and he came up to me afterwards. He's like, "You've just described my entire life." It's like, so I've never had this experience where someone that I didn't know, like literally described my exact operating system and how I live my entire life 100%. And then as we got to know each other, you know, I learned about everything he was doing. So it was kind of one of those really serendipitous moments.
You mentioned the spiritual when you were talking about Oprah and Marianne Williamson. For you, is like having a spiritual understanding of oneself and of all of nature and intuition, are they like inexplicitly linked?
I think that intuition leads you to the latter, but you could totally use intuition from a hyper, like, you know, rational perspective too. You could completely leave out what is typically considered on the spiritual end of the spectrum and still have an amazing experience with intuition, because like it in and of itself is almost like a skill, like, you know, learning to breathe or walk or something. So just tuning it into that level alone as a skill, as a faculty that we have, like you could go really far with it. But I think that intuition, in my opinion, like peels back layers of illusion and starts to bring you closer and closer to the true nature of reality. And in that sense, I think there is absolutely a spiritual dimension to reality. And so I think that people that really, I mean, like if you look at all the quantum physicists, like all the pioneering physicists, they all became spiritual. Every single one of them. Einstein, Fermi, David Bohm, like all of these guys, right? They all end up like believing that there's like this huge collective intelligence in the universe, because if you really study these things, if you really go there, you know, you can't help but see that. And all of these guys were masters of intuition too. Hyper-rational, hyper-logical masters of intuition. I mean, Einstein was a huge proponent of it. He talked openly about it. The other guys, I mean, where do you source these crazy ideas? You know, right. It's like...
And where do you get the balls, I want to say, to...
Yeah, or the ovaries, yeah.
Yeah, or the ovaries. But most of these people in history had balls. Yeah. But where do you get that courage to pursue this glimmering idea that you have? Yeah. It doesn't seem to make any sense in the reality that exists as it is.
Right, and that typically people get ostracized for in that moment because it's so counter to what everyone else believes, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing, actually, when you look at it. Like, we've been compiling one of like the largest databases of intuitional research and just kind of case studies and, you know, anecdotes and empirical things that we can find about intuition. And when you look at most of the most influential people in history, they all were sourcing from intuition really strongly and were either quite vocal about it or in their closest confidants would talk about it. And again, part of the reason for that in our experience is because when you're playing at a really high levels of complexity and just really playing big games like that, like you transcend the abilities of the rational mind and you have to operate from intuition or you're essentially you might as well be wandering blind through a forest, So
yeah, I love that. And I mean, for me, my journey into trusting my intuition was very much a spiritual journey. And it was very much having to peel back the layers of conditioning to find something that actually I remember very clearly as a child being a very strong part of my experience. But I'm interested because I've never really done this sort of empirical research. Can you share with us a bit more about that?
Yeah.
What you found? And
yeah, definitely. I mean, it's really kind of at the cutting edge of a lot of research into consciousness. Like consciousness is actually like one of like the big three areas of research that is controversial and at the cutting edge of what's emerging in various sciences. I would say quantum physics, like understanding the nature of reality and just quantum everything in general. Maybe AI, you could say things on like on the technological wavelength and to some degree the human genome, so probably between those three or four things, as those are really like the cutting edge of emerging science. But consciousness is such an interesting one. Yeah, intuition is one of those things that it's something that's so subjective a lot of times that it's hard to experience and it's kind of mysterious too. So like I have a book now that's like basically a compilation of all of the best research on intuition in the world. And the opening line in the book is that, there's so many different perspectives. Some of them are conflicting with each other. Like we need to figure out how to like synthesize and develop like a common shared language here. And so
this is your book, or this is
a book by an Australian woman who's kind of like a researcher into intuition.
What's it called?
The Handbook of Intuition Research. Heady, it's all academic papers, but it's really fascinating if you want to kind of get a handle on like some of the research that's out there and like what people are finding in relation to it. When you really like cut through all of the noise and the conjecture and the opinions and you just look at the research and like the hard data that's been found from people studying intuition, it's extraordinary. It's, in my opinion, it's the most significant findings, that we've almost ever had. And I think that we're currently like, the collective conversation was like, we're in the information age right now. We're in the information age. Eventually we'll max out on what we can do with information. And the only next step will be to go into the intuitional age. Like people, like the funny thing for me, for example, is that like now AI is the big conversation, and rightly so. It's definitely like at the cutting edge of what we're doing as a collective human culture. But AI, its capacity pales in comparison to the capacity that you have with your intuition. So for me, it's almost like a straw man, where it's like we're devoting all this time and energy to building a robot who can do what we can already do, but who could only ever do it like at a fraction of our capacity. The reason that everyone's so excited about AI is because most people are completely operating from their rational logical minds again. Mm-hmm. And so the rational logical mind maxes out at 60,000 bits of data per second. The intuition tends to max out at about 60 million bits of data per second. So literally like 1,000 times more powerful. And that's just the parts that we can measure. There's also parts that are immeasurable, like non-local aspects of intuition that are just completely beyond our ability to measure. So intuition, in my experience, is what allows us to become truly infinite. There's almost like a catch-22 in developing like AI and really sophisticated technology, because then what's going to happen is people are going to just start to rely on that, and there won't be as strong of a pull to develop your intuition because the robot's just going to think for you. And
right. In the same way we can't count anymore because we have calculators.
Yeah, totally. A lot of what drives me is that like I'm really wanting to anchor in intuition. Like we need to take this seriously as a culture. However we can forward that movement and however we can teach people how to tap into it and just show them like what it offers, then I think that's super important. There's another layer too, at risk of me kind of just going on for a while here.
No, I love it. Yeah. I'm inviting it.
This is a second or third layer. I don't know how many examples I've given here, but basically, so when you look at nature, right, like we're sitting, for people listening, we're sitting in the middle of the jungle essentially right now. And there's just immense trees and flowers and bugs and animals and, plants everywhere around us. And yet...
And a child in a swimming pool that you might be able to hear.
Yeah, a child in a swimming pool. Yeah, exactly. Nature has no sophisticated language like humans do. It has no official school like humans do. And yet it's always in perfect flow. And there's always a beautiful homeostasis. As long as humans aren't intervening, like nature is taking care of itself, there's always infinite abundance. Everything always has exactly what it needs. There's this perfect homeostasis. When you really get deep into how nature operates like that, it's through intuitive capacity in plants, in animals. We call it instinct, or some people might say it's genetically programmed or whatever. But the truth is that there's this deep intuition running through everything. And in my experience and what we're teaching at the Institute, intuition naturally brings us into the same kind of flow that nature does. So when we're all collectively operating from intuition, we don't have to try and solve our problems so much, because we naturally do the things and become the people and make the shifts that we need to in order to operate in this perfect flow. It's literally like us tapping into the universal intelligence that Bohm called implicate order. Like, we access implicate order through our intuition. If we just stay in that space, we don't really have to worry about the details. Like, everything else kind of naturally takes care of itself. So I think it's super important on that level as well. And a lot of the research shows that it puts us in that space. And so that's really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we are doing kind of similar work, but in very different ways. So I'm working with people with my intuitive therapy work, which is very much around shifting subconscious patterning, but essentially opening up qualities that are dormant within, which could all be described as intuition.
Right.
And with my mentoring program, a big feature of that, of my intention behind it, is to take people on that journey where they then do start to really trust and live by their intuition. But I do it from a very mystical place, because that's how I've experienced it, that's how I've understood it, that's how I understand how to sit with someone in it. I'm fascinated by all of the research, and I love that you have all this body of information and knowledge around it. I perhaps am a bit more romantic about the mystical. I love to keep it a little bit unknown.
So I'm 100% with you. I love that you approach it from the mystical. I think that's the funnest, most interesting lens. And I think it is hugely mystical. There's so much, as much as we know about it, we only know a fraction about it too. Yeah. So I love that. The science is interesting, but when you have the mystical experiences, that's the peak.
Yeah, totally. But it's also really fascinating to have this backing up of the mystical through science. Or I wonder, it's really interesting, this need to prove everything that we have as humans. The fact that, I remember discovering that Einstein had said some interesting spiritual things and things about intuition, and then that making it okay.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That in our culture, because we are so much in our rational minds, and there is so much fear around this potential that we have, this incredible infinite potential, and we're operating at such a tiny part of who we really are. And yet we need a dead man to tell us that it's okay to be interested in this.
Yeah.
It's a bit ridiculous, but I understand it.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah, I think the way our culture's moved now, science is, scientism, right? Some people say scientism. It's the new religion. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we've moved from Catholicism and Hinduism and, Islam and whatever to scientism.
Right.
So now you have to so if you want an idea to be accepted, you need to, be able to explain it or show that there's evidence in those terms, and then people will start to believe it.
Right.
So I think culturally where we're at, it's valuable. I mean, obviously, in the past, the shamans were the the intuitives in most cultures, and people just are they're pretty wise.
Yeah. Yeah, the shaman, the priests, they were the ones. There were always medicine people in every community that everybody went to, regardless of class.
Yeah.
To kings, queens would go to these people in order to find out what to do next, or to deal with health issues, that kind of thing. And I wonder as well, that all still happens, but it isn't necessarily shared in public. But I know many healers that have worked in all kinds of places that you think that psychics and healers do not work.
Oh, no, totally. Yeah. There's a joke. sometimes, I don't know where I heard it first, but like, they're like, millionaires don't believe in astrology, billionaires do. And it's just kind of like alluding to that, especially here in Indonesia.
Yeah, but even in America and in the UK, I mean, I've heard of psychics that have been working in government departments, and all of that stuff is there. And so even though we have this like illusion of the rational mind, like being what's leading everything culturally, it's probably not true.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I mean, I'd say that there's maybe like a 51% swing. So like slightly, but like when you really break it down, it's as mystical as it's ever been, but the illusion is that it's all scientific, it's all buttoned up. Mm-hmm. For sure. I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating. It's like this peeling away of the layers, you just think, it makes you think that anything that you look at and you have all these assumptions and all this sense of what that is based on our cultural information, and how if you just peeled back a few of those layers, you could see everything completely differently.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's really a large part of the name of the game with flow, to kind of harp on that for a second. It's like, really, we often say it's a new operating system for consciousness or for your mind, because it's, at the end of the day, like if you can train yourself to perceive the world in a certain way, you can basically lock yourself into permanent flow. I mean, everything is perception. Everything is perception. And so that is the key to so many things. You can really, we lose resolution in reality by like limiting our perception to only what's accepted scientific fact. Mm-hmm. When you income like this, and this is, I think, such an interesting aspect of like where things are going, where it's like, you can't really explain reality fully just through the current scientific lens. Like, you leave out a huge amount of experience that is filtered out because like people just don't believe it's possible. It's so interesting like we were at Science and Non-Duality conference last year around this time. It's a meeting of basically scientists and non-dual spiritualists, and then people that are somewhere in the middle. I remember having this discussion with a quantum physicist who was firmly in like the materialist reductionist camp. And when I presented him like evidence of consciousness being much more mystical than, it's been described in some of those circles, instead of like going, like, wow, that's so interesting, I'll have to consider that. Instead, he started to attack the research. He just like immediately was like, oh no, I bet you the quality of that research is very low. So it couldn't be true, because like his perception was that that's not possible. And so he literally cut himself off from every single experience that was outside of like that perceptual filter, and was completely operating from there. And we do that so often. I mean, you don't have to be a quantum physicist, but like just every single belief we have like affects how well we see reality.
Totally. And perhaps we can hear, there's that tendency to be like, well, I don't do things like that. But then actually when you just look a little bit deeper, you're like, oh yeah, I do. Yeah, totally. Just having that ability to mindfully self-reflect is so crucial, to really just get out. That's one of the things I love about travel, is that, and a lot of people like have their first like powerful experiences of flow during travel, because travel is like you getting outside, especially when you go to some really far-flung place. It's super different. It's like you getting outside of all of your operating assumptions about reality and getting into a culture where it's completely different. And so it forces you to kind of see everything that you've been doing and through a different lens. And then you go, oh, wow, maybe that wasn't constructive, or that was really great, or whatever. Yeah. There's that sense, people talk about, they go to Burning Man, and I've had this experience at Burning Man, you feel like you're in this complete synchronicity playground where everything is just appearing in perfect synchronicity with your intuition. And a lot of people feel like that in Bali when they come here.
Oh, yeah.
What do you feel are the other conditions that support accessing? I mean, I suppose we're talking about the state then, because we're talking about people having experiences that show them the state, which is the step towards living in the consciousness. Right. Yeah. So what are some of the other, I guess, conditions that support flow states?
Yeah, totally. It depends on if you're looking at flow states or flow consciousness, because the way that they're accessed is a little bit different. So in flow states, you need the proper conditions to be present in order for someone to go into a flow state. But conditions are typically, like, in some of them deal with things that we have conscious control over, and other things are sometimes outside of the self. Flow consciousness, you access flow through principles or through following intuition or being in a specific state of mind or being. So there's a little bit different access points. So the cool thing about flow consciousness is that it's not dependent on a location. Like, people love like, if you really simplify Burning Man down, I mean, I have so many burner friends that, like, in doing this, I feel like I can already feel some of the pushback. But if you really like strip everything away, strip all the details, all the experiences away, like, people love Burning Man because for most people, it's the peak flow state that they'll ever experience. You know, you could say that, oh, it's about the art, but all of those things are essentially shooting people into, like, this semi-altered state of consciousness where they're having the time of their freaking lives, you know, or deep learning or deep challenge or whatever it is. But all of those things are part of flow state. So people are essentially going into this super elevated flow state. And I think that's a big reason why Burning Man is so popular, because it's currently, like, the best flavor of flow state on the planet. It's like one of the top, you know, ones. You ask anybody that's gone and has had a good time, and it's incredible. There's really nothing else like it. So in terms of flow states, like, you know, the challenge is that typically they arise when you're in the right place, the right conditions, the right people, the right state of mind, etc. And hence they're fleeting. States are fleeting. Flow consciousness, on the other hand, you can be in deep flow consciousness by yourself in the middle of the Kalahari Desert, you know, in Africa. You can be in flow consciousness on a New York subway where everyone's pissed off and, you know, you're at rush hour and everyone's upset, but you can still be in flow consciousness. So most people, if they're just chasing flow states, would have challenges being in flow states in those different, I mean, you can always find a way, but it could be more challenging in those circumstances. So conditions for flow consciousness, strong alignment with intuition, deep inner healing, and rewiring perception to engender flow. So that's something that we haven't talked about so much yet in this conversation, but, like, we've identified certain belief structures that lock people into an experience of ongoing flow. So adopting those belief structures allows you to stay in flow wherever you're at. So between that and intuition and a couple of sub-principles around balance and really being in a place of, like, kind of deep non-dual consciousness, like, you're able to track flow in real time in whatever experience that you're in. Flow states, on the other hand, typically our research there's a lot of overlap with existing flow state research, but our research on group flow there's some principles that we've identified that we haven't seen quite as well mapped in the traditional community around it. But having a shared challenge or having a personal challenge or evolutionary imperative is what we call it, where it's basically like you're being stretched to the edge of your capacity and some wavelength, but there's a fine sliver. Like, if you overshoot your comfort zone too much, people can go into paralysis and completely shut down. And if you undershoot it, then you don't have the flow experience necessarily. So there's this kind of band, like, if you think about your growth edge as a line, there's, like, a band of, like, a couple degrees on either side of it where you can have, like, a really powerful flow experience through getting yourself into a challenging situation that you haven't been in before. Having coherence with people. So, like, we're experiencing some level of flow state here because we spent time dropping in and doing yoga together and meditating. Like, all of those practices are practices that build coherence, authentic relating, you know, eye gazing. There's a million ways to do it, but all of those practices, like, build coherence between individuals. As an individual, you could also have coherence in your environment, like you walking out and doing kirtan by yourself on the place where you guys are going to build the yoga barn. You know, you can go into this deep coherence with nature and start to experience it that way. That can send you into a flow state. I'd say on the state side of things, the two things that you're looking for are, like, potentially external conditions that can allow you to shift into flow. So being in a group of people that are already in flow, you know, being in an area where you feel really nourished or you feel really challenged. And then internally, like, being in a state of perception or internal experience where you can enter flow through challenges, through meditation, through all these other different experiences. So there's a lot of ways to access it, but, you know, there's kind of a breadth there on this long spectrum of ways to tap into it.
Mm-hmm. Hello, this is Amisha. We are just taking a little break from the conversation here. On behalf of myself and the team, I want to say thank you for being part of creating a beautiful future. We make this for you so that we will all have the vision, wisdom, and activism we need at this time to weave a new narrative. Can you help us with this? You can do that by making a monthly donation to the podcast to cover our costs. Just the equivalent of a fair trade banana you might eat or a chai latte you might drink whilst you listen to this will make a huge difference to us. Head to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community to become a monthly patron. And the other thing is to tell your friends about this podcast so they can tune in too. Send them a message or post on social media and let them know what you love about it. And whilst you're at it, leave us a review. And now, back to the conversation. Thank you for your loving beauty. So with your institute, there's a lot of different things that you offer to kind of tap these different points and these different entry points.
Yeah. I mean, we try and simplify as much as possible into a lot of what we teach is based around first principles, because I think that it's easier to make things complex than it is to make things simple. And yet reality is already so complex that we need simple solutions. So we try and figure out okay, so I just rattled off a lot of things. The question we would ask ourselves was how do we simplify everything so that there's just one thing that you can focus on that'll naturally allow you to do all of those things at the same time. So we do a lot of things, we research a lot of things, we're into a lot of things, but all of our trainings and everything that we do, we're always trying to radically simplify and take these big kind of abstract, lofty ideas and concepts and make them really actionable and practical and tools that people can use to shift their life experience measurably.
Mm-hmm. And so is it do people come and spend time with you in retreats, or is it a one-to-one thing, or is there a bit of everything?
Yeah, I would say the main way that people interface with us is through our trainings. So we facilitate online trainings and in-person trainings, but online is easier these days because people can access it anytime, anywhere, any place, according to their life rhythms. So we offer a number of trainings that basically teach the core fundamentals of living in flow, advanced aspects of it. We do a lot of speaking, we do a lot of workshops. We haven't been doing too many in-person events that are just open to the public, but we definitely work with people. A lot of times people will just come and do an intensive with us and they'll have a personalized experience of flow, or we'll do consulting on their project or their retreat or whatever. So it's kind of all over the place really, but flow is a thing where it's the value is immense, but only certain people realize the value of it. Mm-hmm. So we tend to end up working with people who realize the value of it and are inviting it in versus just trying to bring people into it that aren't ready for it yet.
So what's the biggest point of resistance that you come across in people that you have worked with or that have come to you but haven't really been able to access that?
What's the biggest challenge in terms of people not feeling ready for it, or people that have come and trained with us, and what's the biggest challenge that they experience in their journey?
Both.
Okay, yeah. For the larger public and just people not feeling interested in it or whatever, I think a lot of it has to do that it's a pretty advanced methodology, and it requires, we always say it's as easy as you make it, it's as hard as you make it, because it's truly the most effortless and easy way to live. Really, it doesn't get much better than having consistent experiences of flow. You're effortlessly supported. All the resources you need to thrive show up in your reality. You experience exponential growth and success. You learn to see the world in a way where you see the perfection in everything, and that allows you to have an experience where you transcend suffering. It's pretty magical. So that's the alternative to how most people are living. So it is only going to get easier. But at the same time, it can require people to make shifts that can be kind of big for them. If you've been in a job that you hate for 30 years, but you make $1 million a year, or whatever.
Or even just enough money to put food on the table.
Yeah, or just enough money. Totally. Or just enough money to put food on the table, and, you're in really a strong survival and security mindset where the prospect of making a leap to live more in alignment with purpose or intuition, or intuition may say the marriage that you've been in for 20 years, deep down that it's really not serving you and you're just staying in it because you don't want to rock the boat. And so if you start following your intuition and it tells you that it's time to do something initially that might be a little challenging, people can sometimes have resistance to that. And so I think that that's one layer. Another layer is that like, it's just new. You're learning to operate in a completely different system than you may have been operating from for your entire life. And so for that can be intimidating to a lot of people. So we try and make it the transition as easy as possible, but there's definitely like shifts that typically need to be made for people. And generally people are resistant to change. Mm-hmm. People tend to change not from proactively, desiring transformation, but literally because things get too difficult. People typically change when things get really bad. So there's not a lot of proactive change going on, and flow is best when you're proactively pursuing change. That's on that side. In the program, and in like when you're learning, I think the biggest challenge that most people have is just like boldness, really.
Yeah.
That oftentimes like their intuition is giving them a really clear signal, but it requires them to leap a bit into the unknown. And there's this like existential fear of like, what happens if it doesn't work, and yada, yada, yada. And so there's this time period that some people they just live like that. They're just like, I'm going for it 24/7. I don't mind making huge leaps. That's fine. They're in the minority. Most people are like somewhere between there and like, kind of reticence around change. What we recommend people do is just like move at whatever pace you're comfortable. If you really follow your intuition for every decision, like things can accelerate really fast. Have you read The Surrender Experiment?
I haven't, no.
That's not actually not a textbook example of living from intuition, but like the story arc of it in some ways mirrors like kind of like the non-linearity of intuition, and why at different times, Michael Singer, who it's like basically an autobiography, he gets asked to do things that just seem like so far off from what you'd expect. People get really challenged with that, a lot of times, where they're just like, I can't see how it's going to work out. So I'm nervous about doing it. But ultimately, every time people consistently follow their intuition, it always works out. It's just the time scale.
Yeah. And it's that fear of dropping our stories. They become part of us.
Yeah.
If we want them to, if we let them. And I've had an experience, as I hear you talk about flow consciousness, I'm like, like I wouldn't use this language necessarily, but I've achieved, I don't know, do you achieve it? I feel like I've recently achieved.
Did you achieve it? Let me get a certificate printed for you.
Thank you.
I'm going to give you a little badge you can sew under your clothes now. Yeah.
And what it feels like is that, I followed a few pieces of intuition that led me to some places, and I fully showed up with presence to each of these moments, and I just breathed through any fear. And then I've had this experience recently where there's these cycles of suffering that I've been in my whole life that I've been like really trying to understand, how do I free myself from this? And it's like they just dissolved in like an instant, and they feel like they would happen almost in another lifetime.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're talking about something that happened like 3 weeks ago, and it's like, and it's just so beautiful. It also feels like it's impossible to go back
to how you were living.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like completely impossible. I couldn't even imagine doing that. And there's no fear as well around losing the state, like, because it's not a state.
Right.
There's no fear. It's like, it just is like, no, there's no more drama now. There's no more suffering, worrying about this, that, and the other. I feel it. It's taken care of. I'm just listening, and I know that it all unfolds. I've had tastes of this. I've definitely had these states.
Right.
Many of them, and sometimes they've lasted a long time, but there's always been that fear of when it runs out, when it finishes, when it expires. And where I'm at right now, as we sit here, there's no fear. There's nothing to expire.
Totally.
It just is.
Totally. Yeah. And I acknowledge you for that and see you in that. And that's awesome. It's a huge shift. Yeah. And it always was like that, Mm-hmm. And that this is an insidious one, but that's like, there's a limiting belief. Like I can hear the sayings growing up, like, good things don't last, or, you know what I mean? Like there's all these cultural maxims, like that we just pick up like sponges, where it's like, oh yeah, everything's great until it all falls apart. But
yeah, you have to suffer. I'm from an immigrant culture, right? So you have to work hard against this, listen to the system, but hold your own in it. And, and you suffer your way through it.
Yeah, totally. It's so ingrained. And the irony is that the only thing that keeps us locked into that is the belief that that's how it is. And when we switch to the belief that you're effortlessly supported and that this is going to be an ongoing experience and you choose to see it like that and you consciously make that choice and then like just let it integrate, then that you start to experience that reality. You know, you see through that perceptual filter and then you start to interpret everything in a way that continues to launch you into more flow. And then you get this self-perpetuating cycle where it does stay, you know? So it's, you don't really have to do anything at that point. Just believe that it's possible.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And you've seen this happen for a lot of the people that are around you that you've worked with?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's a small percentage of people that just kind of naturally kind of crack this. They don't always have like the, you know, like the tight language around it because they don't study it like this, but it's a really small percentage of people that like naturally fall into this way of life. Then they're the people that we work with, us obviously start to develop like conscious competency around it. We were here in Bali. We probably have like 25 people that have been through our trainings that just happened to be here at the same time we're here. And so we got to check in with them, a lot of them after like not having seen them for a couple of years. And all of them are just like, my life is just like, kind of like you were saying, they're like, my life is so amazing now. And these are the people that really embraced it, you know, because we do have people that like, the way we can facilitate the trainings is it's like, it's not possible for us to like hold everyone's hand as they go through the process. So there is like some, you know, self-motivation that's necessary. But the people that like actually, we always say like the people that show up, if you show up and you just put one foot in front of the other and put it into practice, you can't not get results. It's impossible. We've never seen anybody fail with it because it's not like a hack or anything like that. It's literally like looking at reality, understanding how it works, and then just designing ways that we can live in harmony with that and really let it throw us, you know, leverage us forward.
I feel like the non-dual aspect of it is really important. And one of the things that happened for me 3 weeks ago was that it was a full moon and I had actually been given a shungite bracelet the last time I was in Bali. And I was given it because I was having this like fear of going back to London. And so this friend said, we're going to go to my house. I'm going to give you this bracelet. It's going to protect you from all of the darkness of London and the plane, and you know, and it's this like kind of fear-based sort of gift, right?
Yeah.
3 weeks ago, there was the full moon again, and so I put it outside and under a, you know, in the jungle. I put it 2 nights in a row, and the second morning when I went to get it, it had disappeared. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. After a moment of loss,
Right.
I realized a little bit later as I was meditating that it was just a understanding that there is no darkness to fear. And so this notion that one needs to protect oneself was pulling me out of the potential of a flow consciousness.
Yeah.
And actually being able to embrace and not be scared of the whole spectrum of darkness and light that exists in our world, and to trust my place as I move through it. That's one contributing factor to this unfolding.
Yeah, so using your shungite protection bracelet.
Yeah.
It's like how you emerge into flow. You removed the protection and now it's like,
yeah,
sweet, now I'm in flow. Yeah.
So what I'm not saying is go and buy a shungite protection bracelet and then lose it.
That's the key. I mean, you just gave away the secret now. Yeah.
Well, we should start making them, no?
Yeah.
Sell them for like £150 each.
And then we'll steal them from you too. It comes with it. Like you put your address in and then at some point in the future, it'll just disappear.
Yeah. So these should be about £700 so that we can effectively steal them back.
Yeah, there has to be like some skin in the game. You know, there has to be a sense of loss with it, because if it's too inexpensive, then it just wouldn't work. Yeah.
Totally.
I love that.
All right. Well, this podcast is probably going to end soon because I'm going to be busy making and stealing. Yeah, you got to go execute on your
business idea here. Yeah.
But seriously, we're not going to now start trying to make ridiculous amounts of money of everyone. If there's like just something to leave our beautiful friends listening with, I mean, we have covered a lot in this short hour, but for our friends listening, where that fear is present, where that need for protection, where that sense of the impossibility of what we're talking about exists, where that voice says, well, that's very well for him, but that's not going to happen for me. What is something that you would like to say to that voice, that energy?
Totally. That's a great question. Anytime you hear that voice speaking negatively, it's lying to you. And when you believe in yourself, and when you have those moments when you feel like you can do anything, or when you feel like your dreams are possible, that's the truth.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Justin.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad our paths finally crossed in person.
And that we got to sit and melt together in this very hot room.
I think we earned the mango now.
We definitely earned the mango. How do we find you? So your website and the URLs?
Yeah, the easiest way is flowconsciousnessinstitute.com. It's kind of a lot to spell correctly. So if you just,
we'll post the link in the notes.
Yeah, but that's a great place. I mean, you can pretty much tap into everything we're doing there. So
brilliant. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mentioned in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?